ultimately, like everybody's going to have different things that they're focused on and that they value and how they make decisions. But at the end of the day, most of them do have the same universal problems. I think probably the worst thing that we could ever do is just start with problems, right? Right. We've got to establish that there's a need for it. There's a problem that we can solve for. Um, and product is not the answer off the bat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, welcome to another episode of the Grow Outbound podcast presented by Discover. We're here live at PMMCon 2023 in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm joined by a very special guest today, good friend of mine, Tyler Nichols. And we're going to be talking a little bit today about outbound prospecting from the standpoint of the vendor side. So we talk a lot about VDMs in the industry, property management, prospecting to potential owners. Tyler, just like we are, is out prospecting to property managers. So a little bit different perspective. I'm excited to have Tyler on. How are you, man?
It's good to be here.
Good to have you.
Good to be here.
Let's start off by tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do now.
Yeah. So I started in sales a while ago, probably just over a decade ago. Started out selling knives. There's, as you know, a couple people on the Second Nature team that's how we cut our teeth. And kind of stayed like direct to consumer for a while. In terms of like outbound, obviously that was involved. I was calling to schedule and book appointments, but came over to Second Nature a little over 4 years ago, directly from Cutco. And so that was really like the first step into the B2B space. And a lot of stuff is similar between the two, but a lot of it is also very, very different in terms of like the conversations and how the outbound is done and that sort of stuff. So
that's awesome. One of the things that I think is really interesting, and you and I were talking about this earlier, like when we started at Filter Easy, the time you started a few months after I did, there wasn't really a whole lot out there about what we were doing. And that was kind of strategic, right? We didn't want to have our game plan of how we were selling to property managers out there for the world to see quite yet. And so the result of that was basically no inbound leads. Like everything we had to go out and hunt for and be involved in NARPM and, make cold calls and cold emails. And, that is obviously very different from what a lot of property managers do. They've got their website, they're involved in the community. SEO is a big thing. And they're spending marketing dollars to get people to call them, essentially. So I'd love to hear from your perspective. Like, you obviously made a shift from a direct-to-consumer product to coming to Second Nature, Filters at the time,
right,
and really having to go out and find everything. So maybe talk about early on that transition of, all right, I've got to go out and kill everything that I'm hunting, right? Nobody's bringing me anything. What was that like in the early days?
Yeah, it's kind of unique, right? Because like coming from the direct to consumer, not only was it different from that aspect, but a lot of people knew what Cutco was.
Right.
And so now in this stage, not only was it B2B, but like air filters, all that we were doing at the time was like the most unsexy thing that you could possibly,
big time.
And so it was an interesting shift, but I think, there's part of it where it's like, you just realize this is a necessity.
Right.
And eventually, of course, like we got to a place where we started having inbounds come in. But I think at the end of the day, like if you're not leaning on that outbound and you don't have that in your toolkit and you're not confident about it, things are just going to be a little bit more challenging.
Yeah.
As stuff happens. So
yeah. So practically speaking, talk about some of the different, like early on and maybe even now, like some of the strategy around, okay, how do I take someone from being completely unaware of who I am and what I do? In the property manager's shoes, it's maybe they're self-managing. They've never worked with a property manager. They've never heard of you, right? Like, how do you take them from that place of unawareness to being interested in what you're doing?
Sure. I think early on for me, it was very easy for me to go straight to product.
Yeah.
And start talking about filters and the importance. And the reality of the situation is, like, of course the filters are great, but we really have to speak to the problem first.
Right.
And I think for Filter Easy and for Second Nature, filters is just the thing that people were always, it was like an accepted failure or accepted a problem. And I think the same could be true for a lot of your average investors. I think we were talking about this the other day. It's like 70% of single family homes are self-managed.
Right.
And so I think it goes back to that point of like, you don't know what you don't know. But once you do start to see the light and see the issue in a bigger way, I think that's really where you can shift in the right way.
So obviously now the focus for Second Nature is resident benefits package.
Yep.
And again, sort of a novel concept when we rolled it out. There are some people that are aware of the concept, especially folks really involved in NARPM, like it was starting to become a topic.
Right.
But for a lot of the property managers out there that aren't involved in NARPM, like you're literally cold calling, cold emailing, and they have absolutely no idea what you're talking about when you say resident benefits package. What I really liked about what you said was uncovering the problem first, right? And so maybe talk a little bit about how you go about doing that before going to a place of, all right, well, here's everything that's included in it. Here's how it works, right? Like not just like dumping on them everything that's in your mind about why they should do it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, ultimately, like everybody's going to have different things that they're focused on and that they value and how they make decisions. But at the end of the day, most of them do have the same universal problems.
Yep.
It's just to what degree do they actually own them and recognize them and see that there's an opportunity there to make that shift. And so I think, that's really the big thing is just speaking to that, because we've got to get some sort of emotion involved, right? Whether it's, hey, have you played this way your entire life in business and have you noticed these things? I think that's one part of it. But I think probably the worst thing that we could ever do is just start with products, right? We've got to establish that there's a need for it. There's a problem that we can solve for. And product is not the answer off the bat.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too is that, as you move someone through a sales process, right? We all know that maybe you have a great first conversation, but then you don't hear from the person, right? You try to set next steps or you don't, you're reaching out to them and having a problem that they're facing that you've identified that you can draw back to and say, hey, really want to get this next call scheduled or rescheduled because as you know, a lot of times property managers have fires to put out and so they need to reschedule calls and maybe they're ghosting you and being able to say, hey, you identified in our first conversation this issue that you're facing. Right. Whether it's, I want to raise revenue per door, or I want to, make more profit on the doors that I already have. Sure. You told me that was a problem. One of my favorite lines, I told Kristen this, I think Andrew coined it. I'm just curious, like, has something changed, right? Like, did you solve that problem and now you don't need me? Sure. Or is there a reason for us to continue the conversation?
And I think that's the best point, because even for you as the salesperson or whoever it is, right? Like what truly feels best? Being able to come back to somebody and say, I'm confused. I thought this, and this were important to you. Does that feel great? Or does going, hey, did you forget all the cool things I've said about my background?
Yeah.
Like very different. One is empowering and I think creates somebody to want to engage in that.
Well, and as salespeople, we see all the time, like, the way to follow up with someone is not to say, hey, I'm just checking in. How can we talk again? Circling back, right? There's all these different phrases that you can use that ultimately you're not adding any value, right? Like they're not reading that email and saying, oh yeah, I definitely need to call Tyler back. Right. One of the things that I think Second Nature does really well, but I think you do particularly well, is the way that you build relationships with folks. And so I think that's a really interesting concept when we think about someone that maybe you cold called or cold emailed that you had never talked to before, that you got engaged in a process. Talk to me about how you like to go about building a relationship through the sales process, but then once they become a client to make that a sticky relationship.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think, like being in sales, it's almost like this constant internal battle until you find your way of, do I build relationship first and then come in to add value, or do I want to be a figure of authority and an expert on a product, get them to that place, and then focus on the relationship? And I know this may not be true for everybody, but I've seen the latter be the one that makes the biggest impact. Because ultimately, like if you've won their business, now that's where it's like, hey, we can create a great relationship here.
Yep.
And know that I'm always in your corner. I'm here to support you. I think starting out on the front end, while it does sound good because it doesn't feel like pushy and, you care about people first, I think to a degree, a lot of prospects may wonder, hey, I've been talking with this guy for 9 months. He's never brought up like us working together in any capacity.
Right.
So I think it's a fine line, but I think you go expert first and then relationship.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think one of the interesting things that we've talked about on our podcast is kind of the art of the discovery process, right? And, the way that you approach discovery, obviously there's some rapport that's built into that. But when you're in a discovery phase, like what are some of the questions you like to ask to really get to the heart of what a property manager is facing in their business?
I'm a big fan of questions that start with, and I guess in some cases they're not questions, they're more statements, right? Tell me about how XYZ has been operating in the past, right? How do you feel about that? Because ultimately I'm trying to figure out like how big is that gap between where they are and where they want to be, and how can we fit into that solution there.
Yeah.
So tell me more about, have you ever thought about, do you ever see, do you ever notice,
Right.
Is that causing pain?
Right.
And I like keeping it that way because regardless of what you're selling, like you can always add in specifics past that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and to your point there too, it helps to do your research on the company a little bit and understand what they're facing. And, I think for a lot of business development folks in the property management space, really understanding the self-managing landlord and what those problems are is going to allow you to ask better questions than if you're, assuming something or you really don't have an understanding of what those pain points might be.
Yeah.
So
Good point.
Another thing I want to ask you about, I think you do really well, is this concept of giftology or strategic gifting. And this is definitely going to be a theme of our podcast, talking about this, something that we try to do really well. What is giftology, and how do you think about it as something that you do in the relationships you have, whether it's with someone that's a prospect or a longtime customer?
Sure. So I think number one, anytime you're talking about giftology, you got to shout out to the OG, John Rulin.
Yep.
So obviously it comes from Pepco, but he's kind of like opened that wide up in terms of what he actually gives. And so the idea here is like, everybody always wants to get a gift for somebody they're doing business with, but in a lot of cases, some of the more popular ones are things that are consumable, and like a one-shot use. So a bottle of wine, gift basket, gift card, and those are great. And it is a nod, and I think it does get people to smile. Sure, they're happy for that moment. But what you're really looking for in a gift is something that is tied into them. It's not swag. It's not a purple T-shirt. It's not anything like that. But it's something that they can use throughout their life. And it shows that you care. I will bring this up. Mark Ennis, this was 2 days ago. This is not my strategy. This was his. So he gave me a Zippo lighter that he had made. And there was some stuff that was engraved on it. And as we're talking about it, I realized like he's been pulling from conversations that we've had over the last 2.5 years.
Right.
And there were certain pieces of that were plugged into the thoughtfulness of the gift.
Right.
And that's the thing where, like that Zippo lighter is probably going to sit on my bedside table forever.
Yeah.
Because I just think it's so unique. It's so special.
Yeah.
Now, did he spend $5,000 on it? No. But did he have to? Absolutely not. It's really about how can you give that massive dollar amount impact.
Right.
And do it in whatever way feels best.
Yeah. Well, I think, a lot of, and I've, in my time at Second Nature, had a mindset shift on this was, your mind immediately does go to, I'm going to send him something that has my company's logo on it. Right. It's mass produced. We've got all these cups that say Second Nature all over them or Discover all over them. And like, that I think there is value in that. Like that is a nice thing to do. But there's something about giving something that is personal to the other person that is going to make that stick out.
Right.
And so, as you think about what you've done, and maybe there's a salesperson out there who's like, I really like this idea. I see how it can strengthen a relationship. right? Like, what advice would you give for someone that's like, I don't really know where to start with this. How do I even do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think number one is don't try to force it.
Sure.
If you feel like you're trying to force the gift because it like might be there, chances are it's probably not there.
Yeah.
I think, a big one that we use is just really paying attention to somebody's life outside of whatever their business is.
Yep.
So whether that's finding stuff they enjoy through Facebook or LinkedIn or even just in conversations of making a note.
Yep.
And I think that's the big thing is like, how far back into the relationship can you pull the inspiration for the gifts, if that makes sense?
Well, it takes attention to detail.
Yeah.
Right. Like you have to be intentional about that. Right. Because if you're just talking about business all the time with this prospect or customer, like you're not going to uncover those things. I'd be curious to know, because this is a very intentional strategy that you have. What have been some of the results that you've seen from that? What are some of the things that maybe, I don't know if you have a story of something that was cool that came about from a gift that you gave that felt like strengthened the relationship?
Yeah. I mean, I will say this, like it's, I've never had anybody just point blank. I've never had anybody be like, hey, we're doing this deal because.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And to be honest, it's like that. I don't know if I really want that.
Right.
So there are some things that I've gotten, whether it's just like through chatting with somebody face to face and just saying like, hey, I don't think you realize how important this is to me. This is the first time somebody's noticed that I really care about this.
Yeah.
And it's really the thought that goes into it, I think, at the end of the day. Right. Like if chances are, if you feel great about it, they're probably going to feel great about it.
Right.
And no one's ever going to be upset with you for going above and beyond from what their expectations can be.
Right. Well, I think too, there's probably some folks out there, maybe thinking about like, okay, if I give someone a gift and they're a prospect, right? Like, does that come across like, oh, I'm just doing this because I want to sell you? But I think there's a lot of really good use cases that don't necessarily need to be that. One is maybe somebody that sent you a referral. There's somebody that is, giving you a testimonial that you've obviously like something that you leverage for other opportunities. Like, I don't think it has to be that prospect relationship. I think it's a way of continuing the relationship, either once you've signed them or, like I mentioned, like them sending you a referral or posting a positive review, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I do think it's big to not expect anything.
Right.
You hear a lot of salespeople talking about the law of reciprocity and like using that. And I feel like in some ways, I feel like that's like dying a little bit, right? Like I'm giving you this because I care about you.
Yeah.
And I think that you'll appreciate this. I'm not giving you this for any other reason than that. But it's got to be something that feels genuine, right? That I don't think, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you've given a gift, nothing comes of it, and then you're later bitter about it, like we're probably off track in terms of why we're giving that.
Yeah, it's a specific mentality.
Yeah.
Right. It's if radical generosity is not your mindset about it and expecting nothing in return, then to your point, like it's not going to feel like there was a return, or it's sort of a cynical way to view it.
Right.
If you're expecting something back.
Yeah.
So the other thing, and this is we're kind of talking about the realm of outbound, right? And we've talked a little bit about cold calling, cold emailing. One of the things that I think you do really well is the involvement that you have within NARPM.
Right.
And you are giving a lot of your time. Some largely volunteer run organization, especially at like the local chapters and the regional. You're really involved in the southern states planning. And I think that there's a lot of crossover there that a property manager can take away when they think about something like maybe community involvement.
Sure.
Because ultimately what you're doing is you're going above and beyond as a volunteer to serve an organization.
Right.
And so I wonder if you could talk about why you've chosen to do that and, how you view your involvement in this volunteer group.
Sure.
As part of your business and the way that you go about, working for Second Nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately for me, it's really about like I have the time, number one, but I think
Right.
we all do 90%
Yeah.
of the time. But ultimately, like I I want to be connected to everybody in the space, not from a selfish way, but from a just like I'm honestly just trying to learn.
Yeah.
And I've just found that volunteering in those sort of capacities ultimately helps you speed up in terms of like ramp or whatever the case may be. And
Yeah.
um, I think even for property managers out there that might be considering like, hey, do I want to volunteer more and get on NARCM boards or whatever the case may be? Uh, there is a 0% chance that it would hurt you in
Right.
any way.
Right.
I just think it's the move.
Yeah. Well, I think too, like for a business development person in a property management company, being involved in their community, right? Like back to what we were talking about earlier with unawareness to interested, right? Sometimes a cold call or a cold email is not going to elicit a response, right? Especially not immediately. But if you're visible, if you're out serving investors, maybe, or just local organizations, right? Their first interaction with you is as a person who's being generous with their time versus just knocking on their door and, hey, come work with me.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I think there are some people, and everybody has a different way of viewing it. I think you could look at it from, hey, I really want to be plugged into this group. I think you could also identify with like, hey, I'm trying to build up some equity here at Issue Space. And so that's one where it's like, hey, whatever it is for you that makes it click and makes you feel good about giving that time and volunteering and adding value, I think lean in on whatever that is. Because again, at the end of the day, it can't hurt you.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to start to land the plane here.
Cool.
So there are a lot of folks out there who are starting to think through their outbound strategy, right? I get this many inbound leads, we close this many, but ultimately our growth goal is here, right? And I think that there are a couple things that people need to understand about an outbound strategy that you have experienced in your career as a salesperson. One is it's going to take time, right? And especially with larger prospects, right? For you, it's a larger property management company. For a PM, it's somebody that has a larger portfolio.
Sure.
It's not a get rich quick way of doing business. It's a long game. Maybe talk a little bit about your mindset around that and how all these different pieces that we've talked about kind of fit together in terms of, winning over hearts and minds over a long period of time.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good conclusion point. At the end of the day, I think what's the most important is trying to be able to detach from the results and understanding that some are going to go quick, some are going to go slow, and it's your job as the salesperson to be able to recognize that, not get flustered, not get bothered, not get annoyed, and nurture. I think the other big thing, though, is having the right tools that allow you to be able to nurture in a way where you're not having to spend a ton of mental space. There's tools that you and I have both used, like an outreach or a sales loft, and putting people into cadences. And I know a lot of CRMs out there now have that based into it. And in that case, it just gets really simple. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. And so I'm a big fan of being able to just like put things in and just move it step by step through the process.
Right. Well, and I think another thing that, we really think about in our world with what we do, both of us, is, okay, you have this goal of I want to close this many doors a month. Your pipeline needs to be 3 times that.
Sure.
Right. And so if you're relying on, if you're a BDM or you're somebody selling to a property management company, if you're relying on one large deal to close to make your number, that's when the anxiety sets in. And that's when the sales breath starts to come out of like, please just sign up with me. I really need this, right? But it's actually the work that you do building a pipeline,
right?
That if you have 3 times or 4 times what you need in there, you're not relying on one large deal to close to hit your number, right? And so it actually takes a lot of work, and that nurturing that you talked about is an important aspect of it, because you may talk to somebody today and they may be interested, but they're not necessarily ready to buy.
Yeah. It could be a long time.
Be a long time. Final question for you. What advice do you have for a BDM who, like we talked about, very focused on inbound leads, hasn't really started to take an active outbound strategy? What would you say to that person?
Trust the process. I think, especially if it's something where you're not comfortable with it, or you feel a little nervous, I think that's the key thing to listen to, of like nerves and anxiety, at least sales related, is like the perfect moment to lean in. And you get a little closer and get curious about it. Yeah, because there's going to be things that you're going to trip and fall over, and like that's the beauty of it. You're not going to be amazing today, tomorrow, next week. But if we were to talk in, say, 3 years from now, like small little wins and incremental changes over a period of time, like that's where the money is.
Yeah, I love that. Trust it, lean into it, commit to it, because you're not going to be able to measure results if you only give it a month, right? Only give it 2 months, right? You've got to commit to it so that you can actually measure how you're doing and how things are going.
That's it.
You nailed it. Tyler, great to have you, man. Thank you for your friendship, first of all. You got it. But also thank you for joining us on this podcast. And I think you brought a lot of value to our listeners. So thank you for listening to another episode of Grow Outbound. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.